And George Monbiot is with me now, hot foot from the camp. We're joined from Cheltenham by Jonathan Porritt of the Sustainable Development Commission and from Glasgow by the former Energy Minister Brian Wilson. Jonathan Porritt, first of all, do you agree that within the environmental movement, George's main point, that everything now hinges on stopping coal, is the main point? And if that's so, then doesn't it follow you have to at least consider nuclear?
It's a very important point, and I wholly agree with George in terms of his very strong opposition to new coal-fired plants in this country. No question about that. To say it's the only point that now matters and that it's so important that we don't need to worry about the arguments for or against nuclear power is, to me, a completely erroneous approach. And I'm sorry to say that today there will have been an awful lot of people around and about in government and in the nuclear industry who will be celebrating those rather loose words that George fired off this morning. And actually, I'm sure he would agree with me that neither nuclear nor coal is the really important thing. The most important thing of all is energy efficiency and addressing that as the absolute priority, then renewables, and then you can begin to argue about the rest.
Right. George, I mean, I'm sure you probably do agree with that point, and you're not an enthusiast for nuclear power. You're reluctant about it. But you've come from a camp demonstrating against a coal-fired power station. Are you now saying that if this were a nuclear power station, you wouldn't bother with a protest?
I don't think I would. It's not, as you say, that I've become an enthusiast, and I think there need to be extremely strict conditions before we even consider nuclear power, like whole system costing of the carbon emissions, like knowing where the waste is going to go and how it's going to be disposed of, knowing how much it's going to cost, who's going to carry those costs, making sure that there's a legal obligation, that there is no transfer of civil nuclear materials to military purposes.
But with those caveats, you are open-minded to the question because you see coal as, because of the CO2 emissions, such a problem?
The approach I favour is of the kind that they're using in California, where they say we set a maximum level of carbon emissions per megawatt hour of electricity generation. And that should be a very, very low maximum indeed. 80 kilograms per megawatt hour, 50 even, which means that only a very small number of technologies could qualify. If nuclear met all those very stringent conditions, I've reached the point where I don't care anymore. What I want to do is to stop runaway climate change, to stop 2 degrees of warming. Nothing else matters nearly as much as that.
Brian Wilson, when you hear this, I mean, this is a big brick thrown in a pond, isn't it? I mean, it's going to cause a lot of ripples, isn't it?
I'm not sure, because I mean, I'm delighted to give George Monbiot the sort of gold medal for slow learners, but I mean, a lot of people reached exactly this conclusion a long time ago, and I'm not sure that he's such a, monumental figure that it's going to cause that many ripples. I mean, James Lovelock, probably the greatest environmentalist that Britain has produced, has been saying this for decades. People humbly, like myself, have been saying it for years. That this whole debate has been overtaken in recent years. Nuclear is an old debate, whether you were for or against nuclear. Climate change is by far the bigger issue. And what essentially the argument is that it never made any sense that everything we did for the next 20 years in renewables would simply be cancelled out by this obsession with getting rid of nuclear. So I mean, it's on a repenting sinners basis, then fine. But I mean, it isn't actually such an earthquake of a discovery.
Well, Jonathan Porritt, that is an interesting point, because repeatedly on this programme I've asked environmental activists if there is any scientific evidence ever that would ever persuade them that nuclear would be okay, and most reluctantly say, when they answer the question, no, there's no scientific evidence at all. I mean, is there no scientific evidence that would persuade you that nuclear might be okay?
Actually, the number of environmentalists who are in that fundamentalist camp is far fewer than you might think. And you heard all George's caveats that he qualified his newfound support for nuclear with. If you actually unpack all of those caveats a bit later, once you've got a chance to reflect on them, you'll realize that in those caveats is basically an impossible route for nuclear. They could never meet all of those conditions. But what most environmentalists would actually say is that if the industry and scientists can come up with solutions to those problems, particularly the risks caused by proliferation, security risks, risks associated with nuclear waste and decommissioning, if scientists can get real breakthroughs in all of those areas, then of course we have to be open-minded to think about the role that nuclear might play if they do all of that. But the truth of it is right now, and George knows this as well as anyone, which is why he's so offline here, is they are nowhere near meeting any of those conditions over the next years, decades, who knows? So one shouldn't really sell out at the moment to what still remains a pro-nuclear hype for which there's no scientific justification.
You've sold out.
No, I haven't sold out. And I have to say...
You have disappointed some people, though, haven't you?
Well, of course that's right. But if we can't debate this openly, and if we can't debate this without accusing each other of selling out, then we cannot take a rigorous approach to the biggest question of our age, which is how we run away climate change. And I'm sure that all three of us agree that that is a question that has to be dealt with. Now, what I favour is actually very large-scale renewables, a super grid going right across Europe and beyond, tapping into the best sources of ambient energy. But I'm now open-minded about what the solutions to climate change are going to be.
Can you see people will say, well, you know, it's great you're open-minded. I mean, Brian Wilson said you're a slow learner on it, but it's good that you're open-minded about it. But if you're open-minded on that, what about maybe GM crops are necessary to feed the world? What about carbon capture? Maybe it would work. Maybe, therefore, King's North isn't such a bad idea after all, because carbon capture technology could work.
If carbon capture technology was already demonstrated, and if King's North, from the word go, was using carbon capture and storage and cutting 90% of its emissions, I would actually support it. I mean, what I'm saying here is we cannot allow prejudgments of any kind to get in the way of the overwhelming priority, which is to prevent 2-degree global warming. We have to be pragmatic about it.
Brian Wilson, I just wondered if you felt that the political climate had changed in a way, because so many people, are worried about the cost of fuel. They're worried about 35% increases in their gas bills. They're, of course, worried about the lights going out. So some of the environmental issues that people have been more enthusiastic about in the past are perhaps fading.
I'm afraid that's true. I mean, it is undoubtedly statistically true, according to polling. I take no pleasure from that whatsoever. I still believe very strongly in the role of renewables, and renewables come at a cost. But energy policy has always been about a combination of the three imperatives, which are security of supply, affordability, and carbon reduction. And it is very difficult to get that balance right. And you cannot go down the road entirely on any one of them and neglect the other two. So that is the trick of energy policy, and it depends on diversification. It depends on a balance, and we do actually. Well, let me just say very briefly why we need to keep going forward on clean coal technology. Whatever happens in this country, but a large part of the world, the big developing countries of China, India, and so on, are going to use coal, and the only question is whether they burn it in a filthy, polluting way or whether they burn it in a cleaner way, which depends on the kind of technologies which are now being developed. So we do need cleaner coal. Clean coal is a contradiction in terms, but cleaner coal as opposed to dirty coal.
Right, Jonathan Porritt, just on that big point, do you think the terms of the debate have changed? Not just about what we're discussing in the narrow point about nuclear, but just how people feel about green issues may be less important to them now?
I don't think that's true, actually. It's certainly true that a downturn in the economy leads people to rethink the degree of priority that they attach to some of these issues. But actually very high energy prices, very high commodity prices, very high food prices, water scarcity all around the world, accelerating climate change. I mean, you'd have to look at all of that stuff with a pretty odd eye and then go on and ignore it and say all we need is to get back to business as usual. So I don't believe that the sustainability agenda has in any way gone slow here. What's happening is that we're beginning now to take into account the absurdity of the economy that we've depended on for the last 10 years, and the fact that that has not done us many favours either.
OK, thank you all very much.